we'll cover, do a little throwback and get back a little bit to the basics of QA a little bit. So instead of talking about current events this week, I figured, and maybe in the future, and you guys tell me if this sounds like a good plan, but maybe every 3 weeks or so we'll do a little throwback and jump back into just kind of QA 101 type topics, here and there. So that way we can mix up current events and stuff in the news with just how does actually QA work and what do folks do in the field? Because a lot of these ideas and these processes don't change that much, and or applies to every industry that you go to. So it's good to get you guys just an understanding what goes on day to day when you have consultants out there, working on site and what they deal with. So, and this will give you guys a chance to really ask any questions and clarifications on some of the things that people do, so that you guys can speak smartly of it next time. So today we're going to drill in just at a high level specifically on what Agile QA is. And for those of you that attended the training class, I believe some of you did, some of you haven't yet. Agile, as you guys all probably aware of, is a type of methodology that that software development life cycles use. It is prior to Agile, there was a concept of waterfall, which is essentially it's a real high level. It's waterfall was finish the product first and then go test the product after you're done finished with development of the product. And there was pros and cons of doing it that way. In the last decade, Agile methodology became more of a popular type of deployment and release process for development life cycles. And the concept of Agile is you have to develop a product and build out what we call stories, and development still goes ahead and puts that into the process. But now you actually have more testing and more feedback loop, quicker and faster in a cycle that before waiting till everything is done at the end, like how waterfall is. So specifically today, we're going to kind of go over an overview of Agile. And so for some of you, it might be a refresher, which is good. It's always good to refresher and ask questions. Others, you might be kind of new to this, so certainly ask questions. And then specifically, we'll see how does QA fit into this whole process and why it's an important part of Agile. Okay. So this document here is essentially was a link to the slide deck that I shared with you guys. Hopefully, everybody had a chance to read over the slide deck, and to see, an overview of how Agile works. I'll go over it to you. If not, I will go over it together today because I think there's a lot of concepts in here that's important to understand. We won't drill down deep down all the way to every single detail, but hopefully you'll walk away in this next 20 minutes with an idea of how Agile works and how QA is an important part of that plan. And we'll ask questions along the way. So okay, so first off, it's really important that folks understand that the biggest misconception about anything having to do with quality and is that the QA team owns all the testing of a product. And that is absolutely not true. In any Agile team that you would talk to, these Agile teams are basically groups of teams that are made up of different types of experienced folks on the team. So developers, you have a project manager, you have a product. Everyone has a skill and everyone has a place within an Agile team. QA has a seat at the table there, but QA isn't responsible for the product of the quality of the entire product. Of course they are. They have to execute it to do the testing, but the responsibility, and this is where the myth is debunked, is that the entire Agile team is responsible for the quality and delivery of that product. And the way Agile works is they deliver processes by what you call iterations. Sometimes iterations could be 2 weeks, some could be 1 week, could be 4 weeks. It's whatever that team has decided to put together a time frame on it. But at the end of that iteration, everybody on that team basically has their all hands on deck, and they decide as a group, is this product qualified and ready to go into the next iteration or not. If it's not, we step back and we go back through the current iteration, start a new iteration, but we go and redo the iteration until we're ready to go. So QA is part of a team. This is really important for folks to understand that the entire team makes a call here, although the QA group has a very important stake in making sure the execution of the quality is part of the process. Okay. So I'll start with it. These are what you call iterations. But before we jump into here, you guys may have, hopefully you guys did see this, and you know, drill into it. But the thing that comes back up more and more here is the word story. Can anybody tell me what a story is in Agile terms?
When you, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, what I was wondering, because when you say story, do you mean like the actual? Because I always heard my guys saying all the things, the user stories. Are you saying like the user stories?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because the way I've heard it before is just one guy told me it's the 30,000 foot view of everything. He says that I know it's like very high level of the requirements, so it's kind of like business terms. So I guess the developers and stuff can get a reasonable idea what they're looking for, so they can implement.
Yeah, no, that's a very good start. Who implements the story? Do you guys know in the scheme of the players of the Agile, who is the person responsible for coming up with the stories or user stories?
Well, I would imagine it's the business users, the people that are needing, that have the requirements. Does that make sense?
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. That it's a requirement in a very loose stage. So the term story in the word Agile is essentially a story. It's even before business requirements broken down by bullet points. So let's use an example. I want to build a mug that allows you to that you can put hot coffee and cold drinks into, and the mug is going to be available for anybody of all ages to use. So that means all size hands and everything. That's a story, right? You're telling a story. You're telling a story of what you want to build or what you want to come up with, right? Nowhere in there do I have technical requirements. Nowhere in there do I have colors and size and that require how much is it going to weigh. I didn't even get into that. Those are what we'll define those later. But all we're doing here is telling a story. Debbie goes down the market and she wants to buy some food, and she wants to buy more than 3 items, and she needs a way to carry it around the store. So we're going to build a shopping cart, right? That's essentially a story. So it really is a story. It's like literally some of these stories have names attached to it, the fictional names, and creating what you call a scenario. So when you hear user stories, user scenarios, they're all interchangeable, but essentially that's where it starts. Any Agile process cannot start without a story. So as you can see in this graph here, iteration 0 is the very first bullet point that says story test analysis for iteration 1. Well, actually, what you don't see on the list is come up with the user stories. So this is actually off the chart. Before iteration 0, which is actually iteration -1, the business requirement guys or analysts are coming up with these really great big stories. And in order for you to even start an iteration, you have to have these stories ready. So it's just like almost getting ready for the big show. Having everything light out before we can even enter a sprint. You have to have these user stories. Okay. So that's
something needs to be on mute.
Yeah, someone just joined. Just hit mute, please, unless you're speaking. Someone in a storm? Driving? No? All right, well, we'll just move on. Okay, so so going through this, so as the other thing to notice here is that you see these things called iterations at the top, right? Iteration 0, iteration 1. I mentioned earlier that every iteration has a timeline to it. It depends on the team, and how they decide to set up their iteration. It could be 1 week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 weeks. Typically, it's no more than 4 weeks for an iteration, because the word agile means fast, and the whole point of this is do things quickly. You don't want to wait, past them over a month before otherwise it's not so agile. Then you're just, you're implementing too many stories. So the whole concept of sprints, when I say sprints, I really mean broken up agile methodology, is so that you can implement a bunch of stories, not a huge set of stories, but at least a finite amount of stories, and then from there have the development team, QA team, and PM team start executing against that. So I'm not going to go through all these, but as you can see that in every iteration there are a set of processes that need to be completed, right? And once you have those stories, then really people can start getting to work. You have the different players in each group, a developer starting to do their work for the stories. In their case, they're implementing prototypes. They're building out, architecting how to do, this story needs to do this A, B, and C. So they're starting to build out some tests, the code for that. And then on the QA side, you're basically doing the same thing and building out test cases. And there's a lot of interaction going back and forth, by the way, in Agile. So this is an example. If you drill down to, say, one of those iterations, as you can see, it's a circular process that starts from the top and kind of goes around these different cycles and kind of circles. Oh, I see Chris has a question. You want to go ahead and ask the question, Chris?
Oh, sure. I was just wondering if the story should be no bigger than what can get done in that 2 or 3 week iteration or sprint, or can it be kind of a macro story and then there are...
That's a great question, Chris. So because we talked about how iterations are defined by the team, and there's no hard definite date on iterations, you don't want to define an iteration into a story. You want to define the story across multiple iterations if necessary. So your story could be a very simple one. Let's make a small little, let's go back to the mug example, right? Let's say the mug, it's the end goal is to build an entire product, which is this really advanced, mug for your coffee. It does lots of things. But let's say, this mug is so advanced, it's a smart mug. Let's say it could connect to your watch and all that. Well, we really can do is we're going to have multiple teams working on this mug. So you could do is you could break those stories down into smaller stories, and say, let's just talk about the handle. For iteration 0, we could say we want to have a handle that is that will fit, soft hands and big hands and small hands, and essentially, so okay, good. So then for iteration 0, that could be just one story as part of that larger story, and out of that, all your development and testing will just be focused on the handle. Does it have rubber grip? Does it have a plastic grip? Is it going to work for left hands versus right hands? These are all things that you start breaking out the story. But at the end of the day, that team is going to decide if they can get the handle work completed in the entire iteration. If they can't, they decide that this is going to take 2 iterations, because this is really a bigger feature than now we want to add, let's say we want to add sensors to the grip so that it detects who you are, and then those sensors will go back to your phone and then measure, I don't know, your heartbeat or whatever, or how warm the coffee is and such. Let's say it's a pretty advanced coffee mug. Well, the team will decide that this is not going to take one iteration. This is going to take 2 iterations, meaning that we might take 4 weeks to do it. And we can't, so they will then break out that story into 2 parts. And they will know that ahead of time before you go and start jumping in and building into this cycle, because what's really important as part of Agile is that you complete the story or the iteration and you have something to show for it at the end of every iteration. There's a step in here, it doesn't say it, it calls it later, but there is a step in here in each iteration called almost like show and tell mode. So the expectation is that at the end of the iteration, let's say the end of 2 weeks, developers, one of their ways of showcasing their work, actually showcased there, is to do like a demo and says, here's what we built. We built this, and here's the handle, and here's the functionality that works. And then QA can say, well, here's the test that we ran, and these are execute. So there is actually a checkpoint at the end of every iteration to see if you complete the story by showing your work and showing them out your test results and all that in your results. If you don't hit it and if you miss it because things happen, then it rolls over to the next iteration, and then you have to then adjust because now you're planning for the next iteration, and you had already some things you need to work in iteration 2, but now you have some leftover residue from iteration 1, so you have to again go back to the drawing board and figure out if that's going to work in time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So let's look at this iteration loop real quick. So this is essentially within each iteration. Let's use for this case 2-week iteration as part of the process, right? From start to finish for say one of these stories. So essentially it's it kind of goes around the circle here. And it tells you down here, but I'm not going to read it all, but I'll just kind of summarize because I think this is important for everyone to know. So again, we talked about before the iteration starts, you have to have the stories ready and available from these business analysts or these business requirements, right? Once they're ready, then everyone will sit at the table. Imagine a room. This is what we call the kickoff. Okay, so let's say it's Monday morning. We have the business requirements ready, the stories. And now we're in a room, and we have all the players. The important players in the room are going to be someone from the product team, someone from the development team, someone from the QA team, someone from maybe a user experience UX team, someone that does design, and then lastly someone that's what you call a project manager that oversees the whole circle and watches the schedule. You have at least one of those, each one of those players in every one of these agile iterations. And so when that happens, you get together and you start looking at the stories, and then what you do is you start the session. During that session, like it's on the board, they're looking at the stories. Now they start breaking it down. What are going to be the main points we need to succeed in this iteration? So let's say that one story about the mug handle is broken up to 5 or 6 bullet points, and those 5 or 6 bullet points are going to be features of that handle. So and so they're gonna, and then you work together to figure out how much time it's going to take to implement bullet point 1, bullet point 2, and this is where we call estimations and goes through that whole process. So all that stuff is being defined at this stage right here. The acceptance criteria is something that QA is really important for them to know, because what they're trying to do is they need to have something that is acceptable to at the end of this iteration. You need to come back and say, we accomplished this iteration successfully. And that means it passed this example, it passed this example. It's actually a test, very high-level test called an acceptance test. So if you're saying this handle is made of rubber, well, at the end of this acceptance test, you need to say, we got to make sure that someone implemented a rubber handle and I'm able to hold it. And that's going to be part of an acceptance test. It won't melt when I put the hot water in there. Now we're not talking about thorough involved testing, like edge case testing. Just a matter of if someone had achieved the very minimum requirement, which is implement a rubber handle, a rubber grip to the mug. So that'll be part of the acceptance test that QA would come up with and work with developers. IPM, I believe, stands for iteration planning meeting. So they talk about all the risk, and highlight the dependencies. So QA is very closely in this process, figuring out what are the things. After they see the list of the requirements, they just start asking the questions. Can I do this? Can I do this? Make sure we have all this covered. This is where QA comes up with using experience and thinking about where all the challenges are going to be and calling those out before you start writing one piece of code. And then the QA kickoff process starts, right? And this is where kickoff means like, okay, now we have everything written down. The business requirements is now translated to these user scenarios. Now they can start writing the test plans. QA then works closely with the at this time, remember now, they're not looking at the code. They're not looking at what developers are doing. They're working in parallel with a developer. A developer is sitting in the other room starting to think about how they're going to write the architecture of this this process. QA is, but they're basing their development off of the main the requirements. QA is doing the same thing, but they're just writing test cases, right? So there's kickoff, and then they'll have an estimation. We'll be able to write some tests against this prototype. It's really going to be prototypical at this point in the next 3 days. The story is the entire team. This is everybody we talked about the story. And here is the development kickoff too, but really the story is when everybody goes. So by day 2 it's kicking off, and now everyone's doing their work. We're talking about writing. Now we're actually writing those test cases. Then they're implementing automated test cases is one of the questions I'm going to ask later, but it is an important part of the process because it allows you to iterate quicker. If a developer is writing some high-level code just to make sure there is say a class called bug handle, you want QA to get in there and write an early test on that. Not necessarily will fail the functionality, but it will test and make sure the foundation of the code is there, and that'll help later. There's a volleyball stage. I don't think people call it this anyway, but BA is business analyst and QA is QA. Volleyball stage is really a feedback session. I'll bounce an idea back over to you. You tell me what it feels like, and then they'll come back and says, no, your test case should really be doing this and that because we want the feature to do this and that. And so you'll go back and forth with QA will go back and forth with the business analyst during the during the story process. And then as you can see, we're getting closer here. At this point, there's going to be the features are implemented. The QA will then ask me to help do some testing. Now they're not doing in-depth, full-blown testing of the functionality, but they're just doing the most common cases that should work. So that's enough to get them past the iteration. So that's where the story testing is, and exploratory testing is really, it's faster to find bugs if you just do testing without a manual, and you just use your intuition and understanding what the goals are of the story, and find bugs quickly. And then automation. This is at this point you're getting closer to the end of the iteration. You do want the computer to throw out a set of results and answers, and hopefully you've written enough some test cases here that will give you some results. And then lastly, I talked about showcase, where everybody on the last day gets to show what they worked on and show the demo. Any questions on an iteration process here? So here's a question for you guys. Why can't automated test scenarios be created if the story is still being created? Like, why can't we implement automated tests earlier?
You don't know what you're testing.
Well, you do know what you're testing, right? You have the story. It's just the story is still, it hasn't been finalized. So yeah, but you can do exploratory testing, for example. But the concept of automation testing in an iteration typically comes after the story is created. But if the story is still changing, do we know why we shouldn't be writing automated tests and maybe doing other types of testing like manual testing?
Well, isn't it because you're not saving any time with automation because you're going to have to continue to keep automating it as it continues to work?
Yeah. A lot of it has to do. The answer is you're right, Debbie. A lot of it has to do with the fact that you don't want to invest your resources in writing all this automated code when your story is still evolving. It's a lot of overhead. When you're doing manual testing, it's a lot easier to change paths and say, oh, we suddenly want this button moved to the other side of the screen, not to the left side of the screen. For me to write a quick test cases and test on the other side of the screen is not going to give me I don't have to spend a lot of overhead time. But if I'm writing an automated test case that is drilling it down to this piece, it takes time to write the test. And if you're moving over here because you're still deciding what you want to do with it, then all of a sudden I have to rewrite my code and do it over here, and it's just it's a big time wrap. So, and automated tests also are really meant to tackle situations that are already working. They're not necessary to find new bugs for you. Automated test typically is there to make sure your code is enforcing your code actually worked at one time. It should work again the following times. Whereas manual testing, exploratory testing, you're probably testing it for the first time or the first few times You don't know if the functionality is completed yet, so you want to make sure your time is spent doing the maintenance work later, which is where automation test comes in. Okay, but it's great because in the future iterations, you just rerun these tests, and you don't have to rerun them again because the next iteration will be just an iteration of this iteration, right? It's not going to be a big change. Sometimes it is, but for the most part, if it works the first iteration, it's going to work in the future iterations. Whereas exploratory testing, it could change. Okay, I'm going to skip all the way down because we're running out of time. I think we're over. One last question I have is, so we talked toward the end, one of the things that are really important is communicating your status, your project. As a QA person, they have to be able to say where we're at and if whether or not we are at risk or not to make this iteration. So what are some types of items that should be part of a QA report toward the end of an iteration?
Chris and I decided we're not answering anymore.
No, please do.
Come on, guys.
How about you, Gail?
Hey, I'm waiting for Mr. Smarty Pants to answer.
Here, Ms. Smarty Pants. No, what do you think, Gail? What are if a QA person is writing up a report at the end of the Agile, what are some things that you expect? You think that person should be reporting?
The defects, the errors, the things that are going right, misses, things that they lost in the story. Let me go on?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Absolutely right. Those are the things that are going to tell you whether or not we're on track, right? And it's really important that the QA folks are telling the rest of the team, hey, you guys didn't implement the story incorrectly, or we found too many bugs and we need to stop and we're not ready to move on. So at the end of the day, there is a little bit of a gatekeeper role that the QA person plays, where they might say that, stop for a second. Where it's in an Agile world, it's very easy for folks like developers or PMs to keep pushing. They want just keep pushing out the door because they don't want to slow down the train, right? They want to keep moving to the next because the next set of work is coming. But sometimes the QAs has a bad rep because they're like, no, we can't move the train further until we fix these issues, because if we don't fix them now, we're going to be paying for it later. And that's always not a popular thing to say, like, to go against the grain and tell everyone that we can't move forward until these problems are resolved. That's why a part of the communication process in the Agile is very strong. But the nice thing about Agile is you can communicate these issues that are a lot smaller now than when you wait 6 weeks down the road and you're bringing up the finalized issues, which potentially that was one of the disadvantages of a waterfall method, where your issues are just way bigger, and at that point people can kind of give up, or they just completely halt the project. The risk is higher. So well, that's it. I'm going to stop there. We're over on time, but hopefully this gave everyone a little bit of an idea how Agile works. Is there any questions or last minute thoughts?
I like you doing this. I think it's good refresher.
Yeah, especially the process, Tony, because I think that there's some fundamentals in here. Are you sending this documentation out to everybody?
This is in a form of a slideshow, but I will be sending this video that I recorded, yes, to everyone so they can watch it later.
Yeah. So there are various aspects in here that we all can kind of Google, but it helps us be somewhat conversant in a discussion. So I think it's really useful, Tony. This was a good one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you guys for your time. We're 6 minutes over, but we'll appreciate you coming out, and we'll catch up later.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye, everyone.